One of the things that disturbs me about our culture is how sort of unprepared we are for tragedy, in a sense. Like,
we're in a bad spot.
We're in a bad spot because
Right.
we don't have religion. I mean, in the way people used to have, religion, that was, you needed that to deal with tragedy.
Right.
So again, I guess it's education in a time between worlds, but you would almost say religion in a time between worlds too. I wonder if
Well, there's a strong connection there. I mean, and I make it in the book, pointing out that if you take education the way I'm taking it and not making it just about modern schooling, but much broader, and you look at what have been the most successful educational ventures and organizations, the answer hands down is the religions. Like, as far as facilitating intergenerational transmission of knowledge and skill and identity, the religions are hands down the largest, most effective educational organizations ever. And it's undeniable. And I would argue, in fact, that the nature of what is discussed in religion, right? The topics of ultimate concern, as Tillich would say, that these things are necessary as a part of education. That talking about death, for example.
Yeah, and it's absolutely taboo. It's like it couldn't be more taboo in modern education than to discuss these sorts of things, right?
Well, we separated church and state, right? So again, there was progress in that move. Let's separate church and state. Back to the 30 Years' War, that was bad. That was like religion at its worst. It was the 30 Years' War. Right. So after that happened, you're like, okay, let's separate church and state.
There is also the fact that there's so much dead religion around. It's not living religion. It's just the corpse of a religion. Like,
right. Well, and exactly. So real living religion needs to be a part of education, or else people don't form identity well. And if you don't put real living religion, and I'm saying that with many broad connotations. I'm not saying like...
I totally agree.
I'm not saying put prayer in school.
You're not saying, back to Catholic.
No, not at all. I'm saying actually quite the opposite. Those could be dead religions, and that a living religion might be something that we haven't seen yet, or a new cast of an existing tradition, but it's certainly not what's kind of sold in the marketplace as religion. And that's why our identities are so odd, and why many of your students would look to superhero movies and Star Wars and things like that for the archetypal ideals by which they might craft themselves in the image of, right? And so the paucity of language of self-evaluation, the paucity of the language of strong evaluation and Cosmo imaginal frameworks makes it so that there's a truncation of identity, and that leads to a kind of de-skilling, which is to say that it's not just that there's an incoherence of how we make meaning of our identity and our life and death and tragedy. It's that becomes incapacitating at the level of just like getting civilization to work. And that's where the trick is, is that like eventually with the mental health crisis and other iatrogenic impacts of the kind of basically the totalized civilizational toxicity throughput on the individual human body, we end up in a situation where we can't man the machines. The women aren't teaching the kids, and it's all falling apart.
Maybe you want to explain that term, iatrogenesis. I can't even say it, but
iatrogenic.
Iatrogenesis, because I don't think many people know this word. I don't think it's a known word, and I think it's an important word, that people probably should know about.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I wish it was a different word because it's a very difficult word. Iatrogenic, like it's like not an easy word, right? But it's actually a very important concept, which is very personal to me, which has to do with harm that is done by virtue of being administered something like medicine that's supposed to stop the harm, right? And so iatrogenic technically means kind of harm done by a doctor.
Medically created disease or
medically created harm or injury or disease, right? But the pattern you can see could apply more broadly, where anytime there's a problem, and you try to fix the problem,
Mm-hmm.
and the thing you're doing to fix the problem is actually making the problem worse. Like that, you can see how that's a general pattern. So like,
Yeah.
I argue in my first book that like, okay, the American schools were a problem, so we used standardized testing to try to fix that problem. But standardized testing actually made the schools worse, right?
Right.
So that it was actually an iatrogenic effect. And Illich makes this argument that there's multi-level iatrogenic impacts having to do with basically mechanical solutions aimed at organic problems. And so medicine's a clear case. But what's tricky is that once you've invested a lot in solving the problem that way, you're also going to be pretty invested in not detecting the kinds of injury and harm that you're doing by virtue of trying to fix the problem. And so that means that iatrogenic effects are hard to detect. And so when Illich wrote about this in medicine in the 70s, he was already seeing things that have now mushroomed almost out of control. Yeah. And I believe we're looking at something like an iatrogenic plague, where a very large percentage of the populations of the industrial West will be pretty severely disabled in the coming decade, not by virtue of addiction and not by virtue of pandemic, but by virtue of basically following the dictates of the existing machinations of the medical industry.
It's interesting. Like we were talking on the intellectual dark web, forum about Jordan Peterson, and people were saying, he's good or bad, or they're having this discussion, and you came in and said, the thing that's going on with him right now is that this iatrogenesis, this mistake and that's like his massive fame, and then suddenly sort of this tragedy happening. I almost want to see that as a kind of archetypal kind of thing in some kind of a way. I don't know if if you can, if that makes any sense.
I mean, it does, and it's unfortunate in a sense because Peterson, the polarizing nature of Peterson will make it so that people don't actually pay attention to the iatrogenic thing that's right in their face, which is to say, if you hate Peterson, then you have to read him as an addict, which means that you can't see that all he was doing was following doctor's orders, and actually that it was the drug that was extremely dangerous, right? If you love Peterson, then you can't see that story, that the drug was dangerous, right? Because now you're actually critiquing the whole medical system, and you're critiquing his judgment in taking the drug in the first place, and you're critiquing his prior statements about the validity of taking psychiatric medications, right? Which are running on the assumption that they don't do harm. That's the assumption. And so if you love him, you can't say the iatrogenic thing. And if you hate him, you can't say the iatrogenic thing. So actually, he's actually going to obscure the issue, unfortunately. And now I believe that an important class of drug, namely benzos, which should be understood as very dangerous to use, not because they're addictive, but because they cause certain forms of brain damage, that these will be misunderstood as only bad because they're addictive, or misunderstood as only rarely are they bad, right? Like that on the whole, he made the right choice. Which is the two sides of it. So I'm actually quite upset about it because honestly, I've never paid much attention to Jordan Peterson. Tried, but now I have, because he's caught up in the iatrogenic plague, which I've been tracking, and I'm seeing him actually becoming a distraction from the plague. That people are caught up in the simulation and not caught up in the reality. And the reality is actually quite scary, which is that it's actually extremely common for there to be very adverse side effects from taking psychiatric medications as prescribed, both SSRIs and benzos. That's benzos being things like Adderall and Klonopin, and SSRIs, things like, classically Prozac. Now just by saying that, I can be labeled.
I know victims of Prozac.
Right. Yeah. So just by saying that, I would be labeled by the American Psychiatric Association as a Scientologist, probably. and part of the anti-psychiatry movement, but in fact, I'm not. I'm simply a reasonable person who's looking at the evidence, and Jordan Peterson, some of the evidence. If you can look past the simulation and to the reality of what actually happened to the man. Now, it's all secondhand.
Yeah, my friend Dave, who's on dialysis, you know, because he took Prozac for, I don't know, 20 years. He was and spent 20 years in bed, and you know, yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm sure there's a lot of people out there like that. Yeah.
Yeah, there are. I mean, it's very.
You said plague. That's a very strong word. Yeah.
Plague's a strong word, but it's a specific word. And again, back to the 30 Years War, back to that period when there was also plagues as part of civilizational transition, which had to do with rapid urbanization without adjustment. Now we're looking at a plague that actually has to do with the side effects of the whole industrial system and a certain approach to handling disease from an industry perspective and a petrochemical perspective, which are all pharmaceutical drugs from petrochemicals. And so, yeah, there's a complexity to the plague, which means that it is arbitrarily hitting, it is spreading wide, it is destabilizing economic and geopolitical, and we're approaching it. And it's invisible because no one wants to talk about it. So yeah, we'll see where it goes, man.
So what you're describing is people taking drugs for psychiatric illnesses, taking bad drugs for it. Is that what you're describing? Because is it much more than that? Is it?
I'm describing basically the entire industrial complex of late capitalist medical system. That's what I'm describing.
Okay.
So I'm describing a system that has young children on multiple drugs at unprecedented rates, and old people over 60, so-called polydrugged at unprecedented rates, none of which has been studied, negative effects already being documented. It's like a massive experiment on the whole population. Like I studied the ADHD medication situation very carefully, and so I can speak to that. Other people can speak to some of the other issues, but it's a massive experiment on the human nervous system. And
can you say something about ADHD? Can you say something about that? That's
we're back to the dyslexia thing, right? So we are looking at atypical nervous systems. Like we're looking at kids, each kid having a different nervous system. That's the facts. Each kid actually has a profoundly unique nervous system. Thank God.
Yeah, thank God, yeah.
And so when you're in a situation where the unique nervous system doesn't necessarily fit well in the standardized container, then you either need to blame the container or blame the nervous system, right? So a lot of what's happening with the ADHD kind of crisis, and if you look at the numbers of the kind of escalating diagnosis and the diagnostic creep and the numbers of prescriptions, it's a large number of kids over a short period of time. And the numbers are actually in my book. I document the actual numbers and the billions being made by companies selling Ritalin, direct to consumer advertisement as part of that, at least in the United States. But what you're looking at is a tendency to want to avert attention from critique of the forms of schooling and put attention on the biological substrate of the individual, right? Which is to say that if school is not working for you, right, is it because you have a disease-like problem with your brain that's probably genetic, right? Which is, at the end of the day, the story about ADHD is turning into some story about genetically ingrained differences in neurological maturation, which kind of make it so that the prefrontal cortex and other parts of the central control system come onto kids at different times and in different contexts and in different ways, right? That's what the story is. In some extreme states of exposure to toxic chemicals and other things, you can get severely dysregulated states but that's what we're talking, like that's a very rare compared to what we're looking at in schools today, where we're getting the prescriptions. And so the argument's something like, unless we change schooling and start to think radically differently about it, like in a concrete utopian way, like my educational hub network vision, where we're actually getting kids out of these intolerable situations and duplicitous situations and self-contradictory and meaningless and nonsensical situations, which is what school often feels like. We need to get them out of there, because if we don't, then we're just going to, ADD is just going to keep increasing and depression will keep increasing. And then there'll be an ADD meds and SSRIs, and then they'll have reactions to both of those. That'll
and suicides psychosis. And people.
Right. And so it ends up being, the kind of, the externalities of the system are being displaced into the bodies of the youth. And when I talk about a catastrophic bifurcation of intergenerational transmission being a kind of vector of civilizational collapse, those are
Moloch or something. It's like
it ends up looking,
mm-hmm.
And it's a kind of generational warfare, actually. It's all being.
What do you mean generational warfare?
I mean, look at the debt, and then now look at the iatrogenic burden being placed on the youth. Like, what are we going to expect them to do? And what are we going to expect them to think of us for leaving them in this situation? And so that feels to me like pretty rough.
Okay, so the plague is here, basically, is what you're saying. The plague is here.
I'm saying something like the plague is approaching, and we are the cause, and therefore the cause is unspeakable. And as a Rastafarian I knew said, he said, "Look how Babylon works. The schools make you stupid. The money makes you poor. The medicine makes you sick."
Yeah, all those things. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. And so this is it. The system has reached a point where now it is turning into its opposite. Right. The system has grown to a point where now its internal contradictions are beginning to dissolve it in kind of its own.
Well, maybe that's the good news. Is it's sort of reached a level of toxicity that is becoming transparent. Like you can see it.
I hope so. But
before it was harder to see.
Well, it's getting harder to see because we're compromising our nervous systems as a result of the iatrogenic plague, right? So this is one of the main problems you have with certain forms of iatrogenesis, is that they affect the nervous system precisely in such a way that you can't recognize that you're compromised. Mm-hmm. So the people on the Senate floor, I think they're thinking clearly. Right? Like, I don't think they know that they're
in the matrix, so
correct. Right. This is what I mean.
So that's what else do you expect them to do but follow their programmed
right. So in the fog of the time between worlds, it's dicey, right down to the level of the biological substrate. So we'll see. But so the iatrogenic term is very important. Mm-hmm. And, hopefully another person or group will somehow bring attention to the issue that is not as polarizing as Peterson, so people can actually look through the simulation of the reality. And hopefully the addiction language around. So that's the one narrative you will see in the culture about problems with the medical industry. You'll see the addiction narrative. And that is actually a very interesting narrative, because it ends up, in a sense, placing responsibility on the individual who is actually on the receiving end of the system, right? Most of the so-called addicts, even on opiates, were placed on them as part of surgical procedure or some other normal thing. And what you're looking at is actually something like physical dependency, which is different than the connotation of addiction. And so that's another thing that's running interference between culture actually seeing the iatrogenic
mass addiction.
Right. It's of course very dangerous to even talk about this stuff because of the Blue Church and the difficulty with these issues. Because when you start to talk about these things, you're talking about illness, you're talking about death, you're talking about fear, you're talking about a lot of things that actually drive our behavior away from engaging with truth. So it's difficult. I find it very difficult to have the conversation. I'm glad we're having it, but I don't anticipate it being well received.
Interesting. Well, that kind of ties into the next question that's coming to me, and that is, I was thinking about media, and I said initially you had this resistance to doing a podcast, and I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about how there's all these podcasts everywhere, and I was thinking about how odd and strange and bizarre even just this kind of conversation is, right? I've got yep. earphones on, I'm talking into a microphone, and you're in Vermont, and I'm in like Avon, France, and the whole thing is very strange. And I've noticed that, I don't know what kind of media I used to consume, but I'm listening to conversations, on podcasts, or even conversations that aren't even at the level of podcasts, right? Just between people on YouTube.
Right.
And it's very odd. What's going on? Like, what the fuck is going on with media? Like, what is happening to us? Like, on one level, I feel like I'm learning all kinds of shit, right? I'm getting a lot of information in the rabbit hole, so to speak. And on the other hand, I feel overwhelmed.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It does. I mean, I have very different media consumption habits. I mostly read books.
Yeah, you're more disciplined.
I spend very little time looking at the internet, and almost no time listening to podcasts or watching YouTube videos. What's happening is that the new point of extraction in the global economy is now your attention. That's what's happened. And so where it used to be a cultural industry was relatively benign, interesting complement to things like steel and automobiles. Now it is the case that the society of the spectacle runs on mining for your attention, down to the micro broadcaster and the platform they run on. And so, yeah.
But on the other hand, isn't this a little bit about what Ivan Illich was talking about? How we
could be
move away from schooling,
could be,
and opening up this sort of infinite education.
But you said you're confused. You said you're confused, and that it's weird and alienating.
Well,
it could move us away from schooling, and it could be the concrete utopian dream of the early 90s when the internet began. But it's not that right now. An informational ecosystem is not an educational environment. And an informational ecosystem that runs on a system.
But there's little corners of the internet, like,
of course, totally. If you're
somebody listening to this could get a lot of fantastic information, right? I mean, and somebody who's maybe not as educated as you are, and not as gifted at reading books, because a lot of people don't even read books these days.
Correct. A lot of people don't even talk to other real people. Like, there's a huge loneliness epidemic. So the other thing that's happening is the screen capturing attention, moving us away from one another and towards the images. And so I believe educational technology, digital technology, networked computers could make Illich's vision possible, but not the way it's currently being used. In my book, I lay out specific design principles for educational technologies that would potentially meet these standards, and they would always move you away from the screen towards other people. Right. So that the proper education.
That's the issue. But even, I think that's sort of happening already. For example, I'm meeting Alexander in Paris tomorrow, and he came here, and we're meeting, and we met online. So I think that that's like a next step, right?
It is, and I'm not the only one. I'm not the only one noticing this, but you have to understand that YouTube in particular, and a lot of Facebook in particular, and Twitter in particular, this is about attention capture, and it's about making money off of capturing your attention.
Oh, certainly, certainly.
Period. And then if we keep glossing it over and saying, oh, but it has its benefits, and we should be on Facebook anyway, it's like, no, you're misunderstanding. That's like the doctor smoking cigarettes in the 50s. You know what I'm saying? Like, no, we know that this shit is actually disrupting our ability to conduct ourselves in a civilized manner. And we know
Yeah,
that
but
it's
I have to also notice that we're talking and you know, this is very interesting, right, and something's going on at the same time. I mean, I agree with you. I probably become an addict of some kind, you know, and I probably need to wean it off it.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. I take your.
So, I mean, and the long form conversation, what we're doing now, is different than asynchronous text-based exchange, right? So asynchronous, quasi-anonymous text-based exchange, like Facebook posts, right?
Yeah.
And Twitter feeds.
Oh, I agree with that. Like, that's 99%
asynchronous text-based, and that these things capture the amygdala and capture so much time and attention. And as they entrap us in that, they're selling advertisements next to it.
Oh yeah, no, I've no argument.
So that they're actually making money off of their ability to capture the amygdala through asynchronous text-based exchange with the stranger who could be, here's the killer, a robot and not even a real person. Yeah. So it's like, why do people who have better things they could be writing spend a ton of time writing there and working for Facebook and working for Twitter? This is interesting to me. And again, part of how deep we are in the simulation and how far away we are from actually looking at what's actually happening.
It's like we're all on acid or something. It's like, I don't know. It's like the culture has been given acid. The whole culture has been given acid.
Well, now you're back to the iatrogenic plague.
Yeah.
You know, we have all been
we're back to that. Yeah.
Given a bunch of complicated chemicals and, including I'm not going to go there. All right. Yeah. So now you've got me down the rabbit hole of even critiquing the sacred cow of social media.
Oh no. Well, I mean, there's no question in my mind that that's terrible. That's like, you know, I don't know. I think probably Facebook is the worst.
Facebook could be single-handedly
the worst thing in the world
down America. I mean,
any kind. You could say any extreme thing about Facebook.
You could actually.
It brought on every terrible thing that's happened. Brexit.
So that's an interesting point about Facebook, right? That's how central what Facebook has captured is that you could speculate that it's having impacts on basically everything. It's the mental health crisis, it's socialization, it's nutrition, it's health, it's politics. It's like, because what they've done is captured our communicative infrastructure. I mean, this would have Illich rolling in his grave, right?
Yeah. It's sort of like the subhuman, subconscious being broadcast 24 hours 7 or anyway,
you know.
But
Totally.
So we keep coming back to this this thing. It's not exactly where I was thinking. I'm planning on going. I didn't realize that. Sort of, you're making me understand what a deep issue this is.
This is why I didn't want to go on podcasts, right? Because it's like at a certain point we get past entertainment and we get into issues that actually make our heart go a little bit faster. And we realize that we may be the ones in difficult situations deciding whether to stay or to leave, right? That we'll be thinking about the basic needs and self-regulation of our nervous systems, unexpectedly caught off guard by doing what came natural as a part of our civilized, socialized, kind of habituated, domesticated lives. And it's already happening. Look at Australia. Like, we go on with life as usual.
But we're in a burning house,
well, it's not even the burning house. I'm just like sitting in the fire and burning in the tragedy. Like we were talking about, to be in the post-tragic is not looking away. It's actually looking through, if that makes any sense. Looking through. That's the only way to see truth, is actually look through.
So we look through, but we don't ignore the horror. We don't,
Right. And the horror is super close, up close and personal.
Yeah. And I can feel inside myself as we're talking, there's a resistance to hearing this. And there's also the feeling that it's necessary, right? So it's like,
well, how do we begin to talk about it? Like, how do we begin to talk about it? Like I said, what are the languages we can use so that we can all save face together? And what are the languages that we can discover that would allow us to talk about the unspeakable, right? Like, and I've said this before, like
uh-huh.
when billions watch millions die,
Mm-hmm.
how will we handle that? What will be on the news and on Twitter? And will we behave ourselves, right? Or will we spiral deeper into the forms of reactionary closed-mindedness that have driven us into the mental health crisis in the first place, right? This phrase, the unbearable intimacy of planetary catastrophe, comes to mind. Is about that we becoming closed back upon ourselves, that there are no escape hatches, that every escape hatch goes in deeper, and that you're there left with the culture and one another.
Yeah. So you're watching, you're observing the plague. Like, how do we react when the plague comes, in a sense?
In a sense, yeah. And also trying to find ways to stop it, trying to find ways to galvanize enough kind of distributed responsiveness capacity at the level of the individual and the community in time.
Yeah.
And
so, at that point, we need to go back to your utopias, I think.
Right. Well, and certain innovations in civic process, like if we could find ways to return to having conversations. This is some of the work I do with Forrest Landry around civilizational design and thinking about civics work. And then with Jonathan Rawson, work I do with the Transformational Educational Alliance, right? Looking at actual concrete experimental work going on in education, both in terms of what's patching together the existing system, which is the best of today, and what I call the first of the next, right? Which are actually truly unique forms of education that are responding directly to the fact that we're in the situation that we're in. And there are examples of those. And so,
can you give some examples of those? So, so we can be a little bit more concrete, like.
Of which?
Of this first kind of education that you're speaking, this new forms of education, new forms of learning that you're speaking of.
Totally, yeah. I mean, which one would be useful in a chat? Yeah, so there's interesting stuff happening with the integration of cryptocurrency and kind of digital currencies with decentralized educational networks and accreditation. Right. So this is the example of the work of Nadav Zamir, who was a principal in New York City, contacted me after reading my book, who'd been constructing basically a way to do like a GitHub for teachers and students that ends up allowing them to co-create curricula and standards. And then he's wanting to compete eventually with the existing standardized testing infrastructures and tie success within his system to a digital wallet, right? So he's rolling out a basic income guarantee to the next generation on the back of an alternative way of assessing their merit in terms of their creativity, and trying to wed this to the New York City kind of schooling crisis, so that the kids who are falling between the cracks get shuffled in and brought up through his digital native accreditation system, as he calls it. So that's an example of like the first of the next, where I don't know. His work it's incredible, but will it be exactly that? I don't know, but something like that.
So it'll be something like that. Yeah, that's
something like that is going to need to emerge, where we decentralize the schools and relate the kind of like, but at this point, not accredited forms of creativity that kids are doing, which are actually going to be socially valuable in the future. Find those to get remunerated through a currency that's not necessarily the one that's about to crash. And so basically using the educational system to reboot the whole economic system is where I'm seeing that first.
Yeah, and you said in your book something about like economics being subservient to education. Like,
correct.
Education is primary, and then economics comes next after that.
That's true. And that's back to the fact that you can't even have the economy unless you've educated the workers. But it's also the case that, to what end is all of the economic production? it is for subsistence, but then beyond that, we get religion. Remember religion? That was all educational, all stacked on top of, and ostensibly the purpose for the economy itself was to channel upwards into these temples of learning, basically. And so, there was a cap put on, and we channeled it back up for its goddamn self, and for abstract numbers and endless accumulation of capital, basically, when we could have been channeling it up and into basically an infinite educational game. And so if you place an infinite educational game on the top of what we know as now the kind of economy, then you end up getting something that runs a little bit differently. So the educational hub network, which I propose in the book, is actually something like that. It's, as you mentioned, the first sentence, getting going, something like the infinite frontier of human potential. That we don't have an infinite frontier of resources on the planet. And I guess we can start mining asteroids, but there is a way in which we do have an infinite frontier of human potential that's already here. And so switching kind of like commodity frontiers from the actual material resources to these resources within the human is already underway. Remember, they're capturing your attention. So it's about actually leveraging the move into noospheric extraction and actually transforming that into a net benefit by turning it into an education-centric society. And that was kind of a mouthful, but that's in a sense the vision. And when you think about, what could be the thing that a civilization could be about in order to exist in perpetuity, it would need to be about finding ways to educate humans within the civilization in order to then make that civilization better, right? And this is Comenius's vision, that the civilization needs to teach all things to all people, that the civilization is fundamentally, that's what civilizing means. It means to be educating in such a way that it can reproduce itself and grow itself and evolve itself. That the educational function of the civilization is the autopoetic function of the civilization.
Autopoetic, yeah, right.
That the educational function is the self-maintaining and the self-transforming of the civilization, which means that you need to make it, in a sense, the focus. You can't have the education be about the civilization building capital. You can't have the education be about the civilization creating wars. You have to have the education be about the civilization being educational. And then you're into the infinite frontier of human potential, and the temple of learning stacked on top of the economics.
Boy, that's important. That's so important. I mean, it's just a total reorientation of, how people are think of themselves as human beings, basically, is what you're
proposing. It is. Yeah. It is. That's one of our difficulties, is that we're going to have to reimagine ourselves beyond the category of wage laborer, for example.
Yeah, going to school and getting a job and all that crap. It's like, I mean, that's not really what it's about. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I that blows me away. And actually, I think that the fact that you propose an idea like that, it almost makes it possible when such an idea is being proposed. Does that make sense?
It could be. I mean, you have to imagine it first.
I don't know what I'm trying to say here. I'm trying to say that, it has to be imagined first. That's what you're saying.
It has to be imagined first. And
that's what I mean.
But of course, there's also the concrete utopian theorist is also always accused of naivete.
Right. Well, I mean, you get me excited when you're talking about this.
Good.
And then I stop myself and I think, it's like, am I being naive here, right?
Exactly, the naivete, and then also the sense that too much of a generalist, that you're moving across too many fields and that you're seeing the forest but not the trees. And so I think this is true, but at the same time, I think that there's no escape from having some kind of articulate vision.
Yeah.
Like we need to have some language about the future. And the other thing, I mean, that's the social vision. There's also a Cosmo vision, right? A Cosmo imaginal vision that is part of that new educational system, because remember, as we discussed, if you don't have real living religion within the educational system, identity, it's weird. So there's another piece to the reconstruction to get to the other world on the other, so that reconstruction that involves rebuilding the kind of Cosmo vision, right? And so this is the work I do with Gaffney, Cosmo erotic humanism, right? The idea that there needs to be a new fundamental kind of way to craft narratives, not a new single narrative, but a new language that's available so people can begin to construct narratives together, and opening the possibility for new kind of Cosmo imaginal visions. I like that word, but it really just means like your story of everything. Like, what is your ultimate environment? And so
I was listening to an Orthodox Jewish person talk about the Messiah, and he was just saying, you know, I got really caught up in what he was saying, and it sounded so true. It's like, okay, if you're an Orthodox Jew, you would say the Messiah, you know, it's not that you want to have faith in the Messiah who will come. It's just like, it's absolutely has to come. And it's almost like, I don't know and I was like getting into this, and I'm not an Orthodox Jew at all, but I was thinking about you know, even we get the darker we talk about all these things like the plague and the extreme darkness. At the same time as we're talking about this, something else emerges. It's like the two things arise simultaneously. You could call that the Messiah if you wanted, or the principle that's going to save civilization.
And there's a saying in the Kabbalah, something like, "Greater is the darkness that comes from the light."
Yeah, there you go.
Right.
Yeah.
And this was actually like one of these Talmudic, like, you know, double marginalia on a phrase from the Bible, which is something like, "Greater is the darkness than the light." But it's kind of like, well, greater is the darkness than the light. That's obvious. That's not, why would you even write that? Greater is the darkness than the light. That doesn't seem to me. So then you reinterpret it. Greater is the darkness that comes from the light, which deepens it and ends up being what you're talking about, which is that, it's precisely in the darkness that, and in the broken shards that the light's going to begin to shine through. And so that's why it's going to be important as things begin to break, and that love becomes primary and known again.
And we don't become sort of ensnared in endless dystopian visions of, you know, and a nihilistic
well, and that we don't turn away from each other, and that we know what to do with the stranger. You know, back to the Jewish tradition, like the Old Testament's about the stranger. What do you do with the stranger? So Gaffney scholarship shows that the word stranger occurs in the text almost more than any other. And so you're looking at this complication around, what do we do when we meet the stranger on the road, right? In between civilizations, in between law, right? In between right and wrong and story, what do we do with the stranger on the road? And how do we not turn away? So that's some of the other facets of the vision have to do with getting that language rebuilt that would allow us to have good reason and social sanction to deal with the stranger on the road in a civilized way.
How to love the stranger, or
how to love the stranger. Exactly. How to love the stranger. Yeah. How do you love the stranger? And according to most of our kind of social science, you can't.
Oh, you don't. Right.
You're built not to. Whereas no, there needs to be a different, it is possible, but it requires these more robust languages. It
requires probably, it seems to me that like religion is coming back.
It is.
It's the opposite of what you would think if you were like a Marxist or something. It's like we're gonna become more and more just free of religion, and more rational and more.
Oh no.
But it seems like religion is just gonna come back like
for better and for
exactly
worse.
For better and for worse. There could be like more and more crazy cults, but also more and more like
and explicitly and implicitly. So there'll be a lot of things which are held with religious fervor,
right, that are not,
which are not technically religious, but that's a religious thing happening right there. And that as the situation heats up, the religiosity is going to intensify. And so there will be new religions, definitely. And there will be a return to religion and to the religious pathos and ethos,
yeah.
even in things that are not technically religious. So that's some of the feeling we're having of return to extremism has to do with that, I think, tendency of the human psyche to find a way to give something ultimate meaning.
Very interesting. Yeah. So actually, this kind of fanaticism, if you look at it as the shadow of something that as you say, that the ultimate, that could be of the ultimate meaning, or yes, strange times. The strangeness of what's hitting me in this conversation is just the strangeness of the times that we're living in. And what kind of religion do we need?
I think we spoke to it, right?
Yeah,
I think we need one that allows us to love the stranger, and and to I think provide non-reciprocated care, right? So we need to find a religion that can get us out of transactional zero-sum gaming and into giving without thought of receiving. That there needs to be profound generosity and compassion instilled in the human heart, and that's part of what allows us to love the stranger.
That's the basic thing, yeah.
Yeah, and so in a sense, I would like to see, and it's funny because in my experience, a lot of the religion that we're currently seeing has to do with state experience, and kind of like, in a sense, the cultivation of personal meaning and the kind of like deepening of intensity of personal meaningfulness, which is important. And so
like sitting and meditating and trying to attain satori or something.
Exactly.
Like that. That's
exactly.
What you mean.
Or doing drugs, right? Or
doing psychedelics and having all these incredible sort of wild experiences. Right. But there's something missing. And so, maybe the ethical part of that.
The ethical part of that, and again, how
the communal part of that too.
Do those things help you love the stranger? And will those things allow you to give non-reciprocated care and concern to people? And so that's just the question that needs to be asked. And so I think, there's an element of explicit emphasis on service and charity that one finds in some of the Judeo-Christian traditions, which could give a shit if you can meditate. And what your state experiences are and how many plant journeys you've been on.
Yeah, well, that's why the sort of the East and the West have to kind of meet on that level.
They do. They do. They absolutely.
We need all of the yogas from the East, right? We
do, because otherwise it's too hard to give. Otherwise, it's too hard to give, and you don't have.
And we need to be able to integrate. We need to have wisdom, right? We need to.
But we also need to have history, and the categories of the stranger, which don't exist once you're up and out in Satori. And so that's what's interesting too, is that as history heats up, those religions that deal with historicity become important, but those religions that say that there is no history become attractive. And that's one of the situations we're in, that you can see, in a sense, some of the religions as a way out.
Is that the New Age? Is that what you're talking about when you say that the religion that is in all this talk about being in the now and that sort of thing? It's like
some of the New Age stuff, it's
kind of like just it's experiencing the moment and becoming mindful when you eat your food, and it's like all this sort of stuff is like, so what? It's like, give me something a little bit deeper than that, please, or
right, and something with content of moral and ethical instruction and of sustenance for the soul in tragedy. There's a difference between getting that unbearable image out of your mind and getting the unbearable image out of your mind and getting the unbearable, and then that's out of your mind, then holding the unbearable image and finding ways to discuss with others. And so again,
I like that at all. That seems to me, that seems to be like, so holding the unbearable image. That's awesome.
And again, that's from the alchemical tradition, and has to do with that process of putrefaction, kind of darkening, blackening, when you're going down and in, as opposed to up and out. Right? Down and in, down and into history, down and into uniqueness, down and into situationality. And that is, so the religions that allow us to characterize those intimate spaces and to place the heroic within the personal, as opposed to the heroic in the transpersonal or the heroic in the public. We place the heroic in the personal sphere, in what's most intimate, in what's most intimate, in the work that's done right here between people in actual conversation. And that, again, as things unfold and heat up, there's this question of, can we stay with one another and not turn away from each other, not turn away from the stranger, and then feel the reality of love? And this is again, like, that it's real, and that it is not part of the simulation. And this happens, of course, when there's natural disasters, and it's always kind of commented upon, like the way, like after 9/11, for example, the number of people who were spontaneously talking to one another, trying to take care of one another, looking after one another in the immediate aftermath, who on any other given day would have just walked by one another, not even looked at one another.
Well, maybe it's more tricky to do that in the ordinary day, when you're just going through your ordinary day, right?
It is, but it's also that
we're not subject to tragedy right now, as we're speaking, but we are sort of leaning into that a little bit, like, whereas if there was some tragedy, yes, our hearts would explode open, and we'd embrace, we want to do something, but it's maybe in the most banal states, that's when it's
but that's what I'm saying, is that
hardest to practice.
There's no like day to day or every day right now in those parts of Australia. Like, there's not like a daily routine that people are stuck in. Like, I'm sure they're trying to find it and get in it. Right. So again, we're back to out of the simulation into the reality of the fact that a lot of people in the West are going to have their day-to-day routines completely disrupted in the coming decade. And so that's this issue of how will we respond? And, do we have the cultural resources to respond in a civilized way? And now we're back to the educational and iatrogenic crisis. So yeah, but there's an intensity to the focus that's needed on the part of, I think, educators and artists and people of that ilk, because it's going to be on them who it falls to create the contexts and languages and symbols by which we start to make sense of this situation. And so yeah, I'm trying to draw more and more people up to that level of creative endeavor and need, because what's existing now in the culture is just not enough for people to be able to make sense of what's happening in their lives.
No, there's nothing there, right?
So they look for more and more and more and more and more, so they get many, many, many hours of content, but never actually the thing that's going to get them something that would allow them to step away from the content and solve a problem. And so, yeah, there's a shitload of work to do, and so many unique individual gifts to be given, all that to be galvanized.
Yeah, I again had this sort of this thing of the apocalypse, right? I keep thinking of all these biblical things tonight. I don't know why, but the apocalypse, doesn't it mean something like the revealing what's there, what's?
It does. So it means the unveiling.
What do you do when this happens? When the apocalypse comes, like that's like, if we're in this sort of place, like what do you do at that point? And that's the whole issue, right?
Right. Totally. Totally. I mean, that's why often I'm like, I'm not super interested in saving the world, but I'm super interested in saving souls. Right. That when you are, think of
Maybe
hospice
a
care.
soul is more important than the world.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So think about
Yeah.
hospice care. Like we're in a situation of civilizational hospice care.
Yeah.
Right. Again, even if something new emerges, this one's still dying.
Yeah.
So we're in a situation of needing to allow something to die and actually, hopefully, finding a way to save the soul of the thing that's dying. And not like, I'm not trying to get into ontology or anything. I'm trying to get into the way that you can relate to something that needs to pass, but still needs to be cared for, and that needs to actually be brought to a kind of beautification. It's brought to a kind of self-clarity, right? So if you think of Erik Erikson's developmental model, his final stage of adult maturation involved this crisis between integrity and despair. And it had to do with how can you make sense of your life in the face of death, right? And you either despair that you can't make sense of it, and it was all you just senseless, or you find a way to integritiously, like in integrity, hold the meaning of your life. And so this is what you do when you face the apocalypse, right? You
that happens. That happens in every moment. Also, it's like
it can,
or you could feel a sense of despair in every moment, and you can also feel this opening as well at the same time.
Yeah, it is possible to get the Ericksonian integrity without actually confronting death if you're able to be aware and, again, burn in the tragedy of all of life, which is saturated with death, and see the transience. So this is where, again, you can't throw the meditative traditions out because they bring certain things in, which is the ability to look carefully at experience. So my sense is that the state of apocalypse is one where precisely that you face the integrity versus despair. And integrity doesn't mean fixing it. Integrity means living it, grappling with it, making meaning, and basically, again, the beautification and the self-clarification that can only happen as something's coming to an end.
It's very interesting that you bring the word beautification together with death.
Yep. Totally.
There's something about beautification and death that those two things. I don't know how to articulate that, but
I mean, what would a civilization be like in which everyone had a beautiful death?
Right? Wow.
Like, that's an interesting question. How far are we from that?
That just gave me this image, of just, wow.
Yeah. And it's Illich too. And this is one of Illich's points. Back to Illich about medical nemesis, like that death itself is a commodified process. That death itself that we're taken from us is the dignity to die in the way that we choose to die.
It's the ultimate. That's why you can use religious language here and talk about sin and things like that, because it really is, what could be more of a sin than that is stealing away somebody's death, or you're also taking the whole meaning
and for Tillich, it was putting infinite worth and importance in something that's not infinite, right? And so that the displacement, again, back to the resurgence of religiosity about things that aren't actually religion, right? Like you hold this belief about this thing X with as much fervor and religiosity as you would as if it was a religious idea, and it's because you've invested it with infinite worth, even though it's not infinite. And so that's idolatry, which is a form of sin, which was plaguing the simulation right now, because we're loading a bunch of incredibly superficial, transient things with profound and almost infinite worth, not realizing that actually it's not going to be there very soon. Or by the way, it's a scientific finding, and scientific findings change. That's what scientific findings do. That's how science works. So if you invest it all in that means we can't have science grow and learn, because this way of viewing the reality of science has become idle.
Oh yeah, well, it's become science is infused with religiosity, so to speak.
Correct. Yeah, now we're to the blue church, to the blue churchers who would string me up for what I said about the iatrogenic plague and psychiatric medications, because they would assume that I'm an anti-vaxxer, which might as well make me a Holocaust denier. And so there's an intensity of commitment.
But it's not even a commitment to anything. It's just an ideology which you've inherited. Correct. It's like you haven't even thought about it. It's like usually, yeah. Or you're just regurgitating things
something you saw on Facebook, right?
Yeah, that's right. Oh, God.
Good.
Well, I hope we're not complaining too much here. Like,
yeah, that's the thing. I wonder who's going to even get to this point and be like, these cynical bastards,
yeah,
self-righteous.
Because we've talked about death and beautification, right? Those two things have been like that's the essence of this conversation, right? Both things were happening at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it.
So I think that's it, Zach. I think that's where that's where we've landed.
That's right. Death and beautification.
Yeah.
Beautiful death.
Well, thank you very much. I think this conversation has exceeded all of my expectations of what it was.
Totally, me too. That was great.